Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Behind the Frame series. In this series, myself and the rest of the Wild Eye team discuss and chat about images that we have taken in various different areas around the world. In today's episode, I'm chatting about an image I photographed in the Serengeti earlier this year, and I'll run you through what gear I used, the focal lengths I used, the settings I was on, and the reason why I shot like that. Now, I do hope that you are as excited as I am and that you enjoy this episode alongside me and at least learn one or two new things as well. Now, delving into this image, as I'd mentioned, it's a lioness in a tree in the Serengeti in an area called Ndutu. So this is the second stop during our Best of Serengeti safari, and it is one of my favorite areas to visit every single year. And I think this image, which is the raw shot, speaks for itself. Now, there's obviously a lot of work to be done on this photograph, and before I do the editing side of things, in Lightroom, I've just tapped I twice, I for information, and I'm going to be sharing with all of you, before I get to editing, the settings my gear was on, what gear I was using, and why I chose to use this setup and these particular settings. So, looking at the photograph, nice and wide, so this is obviously telling us a wide angle lens was used, and you can see by the name of the file, .orf, it's an Olympus RAW file, so I do shoot Olympus now, and Olympus being a micro 4/3 sensor within their cameras, you basically multiply each focal length by 2. So in essence, it's telling me I shot this at 12 millimeters. What you can do here is times that by 2. I was shooting at 24 millimeters to get a nice wide angle. And the reason I did this is because Ndutu just screams beauty everywhere you find yourself, especially when you're with lions in a tree. So it's great getting a nice tight close kind of portrait of a lioness in a tree, and there's many moments and opportunities to do that. And if you're lucky enough and you actually get the time to use very different focal lengths, do so. Make advantage of the time you have with these animals and use your varied focal lengths from 400 to 100 to 24 to 10 millimeters, however wide you want to go, because this will allow and ensure that you get a very diverse set of images from the very same scene. So shooting tight like this is something I did, but the images that I really enjoy most about and from the scene are these wider scenes, because Ndutu is all about these beautiful acacia trees in which these lions jump up. And the really cool thing about this scene is that it was literally 10 minutes from camp, if that, 5 minutes, like 200-300 meters along the marsh floodplains up into camp. So this was right on our doorstep, and we were the only 2 vehicles there. Myself and Johan and our guests enjoyed the sighting all by ourselves. So we had this girl who was up in the tree. She kept standing up, kept yawning, kept looking around, because she had her sisters all around her in this. She was the only one up in the tree at the time we arrived and found them, but she kept hearing them, so she'd get up and she'd look and she'd stretch, she'd lay back down, and eventually it got to the point where her sisters on the ground also got unsettled, and they then decided, well, I want to see what it feels like to be up in this tree, and they started interacting on the tree, playing with each other, jumping out, jumping in, climbing the tree, standing, overlooking the pride lands. It was a phenomenal moment, and this destination is always something I love getting back to. So how I set my gear up and how I recommended my guests set their gear up is to shoot wide, as you see in this photograph. And the reason for it is because of this beautiful tree she was sitting in is working like an incredible leading line, leading your viewer's eyes straight up this tree right towards the lioness standing up in that fork over there. And that gap as well, even though it's wide and she's smaller, her silhouette and her outline is good enough and great enough and impactful enough for us to realize that this is a lioness standing in a tree. How awesome. So, as you see, 24 millimeters shot at 1250 ISO because it was quite dark. Like I said, we were en route back to camp, last bit of daylight we had. We actually got back into camp a lot later that evening because by law you need to be in before sunset, but obviously with a scene like this we could not just leave. My lowest apertures on that, well actually it wasn't, I could have went down a little bit more, but I used f4 just to buy myself a little bit more depth of field throughout this tree and the scene in the background. Remember, naturally, the wider you shoot, the greater your depth of field is. The tighter your focal length, the shallower your depth of field. So that's why in this photograph I could get away with an aperture that was not all too high. And then lastly, my shutter speed of 1/800. So this will freeze any moment in which she starts yawning or she turns her head or stretches, because that won't be fast and rapid movement. But if I was gearing up and getting ready for her to get down, which they eventually did, I ensured that my shutter speed was over 1,000th of a second, so at least 1,250, 1,600, somewhere there, because that action of her walking down, and especially the jump out of the tree, could obviously result in a lot more motion and more of a rapid motion. So you want a faster shutter speed to freeze that. So in a scene like this with her just standing staring, perfectly fine at 800th of a second. So how will we start editing this image? So I've tapped R to take me into my crop tool. Let me just open up my side here. And this image, I would recommend somewhat of a crop to somewhere maybe around here. Now the reason I do this crop, or choose this crop, is that we've still got this tree's kind of anchor point in the ground as a leading line up from the bottom left, which is taking our eye up into the right hand side of the frame. The power point is just below the lioness's paws on the branch you're standing on, and another power point on this leading line up. So in terms of placements in the frame and just the general flow of the image, so from bottom left all the way to the top right, really works well with this crop. So I'm going to hit enter there, and that's the crop I'm going to use. I always start down in basic for the most part, and I will push my whites up. So I'm pushing and holding Option or Alt, and you'll see the entire image is black. But as soon as you start seeing color being introduced as I draw right, this is where I'll find pure white. So I've got a few specks on the top, and that's where I leave it. Do the same for the black. Now you can see at 0 there's already pure black in this, so in this case I can actually draw right just to get a few specks of pure black. And just by doing that, you'll see I'm pushing backslash to before and after. You can already see quite a big difference in that photograph. Now I purposefully, apologies for this, I underexposed heavily in the scene. I didn't mention this in the beginning, but I underexposed by, I think it was, one full stop. So that is quite dark for the scene, but the reason I had gone that route, if I go back to my before, if I had overexposed that scene to make the foreground look good, do you notice I lost all the detail in the background? But by underexposing, and the more you underexpose, the more detail you hold in that sky. But you need to be mindful of when you're shooting like this, you want to take very close a close look at your histogram. Right now we can see it on the top right, and it's peaking ever so slightly in the shadowed regions. Now naturally I've underexposed to maintain details in the clouds and the color in the sky, but my darker areas like these trees, this piece of bark there, that piece of bark there, are very dark. So if I hover over that triangle or just simply tap J, you will see the areas that are clipped. So these blue areas are areas in which I have now lost detail. So I've underexposed to a point to maintain cloudy or mood in the cloud, but notice that none of the detail in terms of the shadowed and darker detail on the cat is being clipped, because now this blue area is telling me I've lost detail. So this is actually a perfectly exposed image for what I was trying to achieve. So let's take the whites back up, the blacks down, or also up, because there was already quite a lot of dark in the scene. Now watch when I just simply pull my shadows to the right, how that lifts everything and brings it to life. I can go drop highlights somewhat, because that'll put more mood into that sky. And just by doing these basic steps, look at the before and look at the after. I really, really love photographing like this, exposing for a dramatic sky in the background. We can use a bit of texture to target our animal and our subject, and then somewhat of clarity, just because we did shoot quite wide here, so we wanted a lot of clarity throughout the scene. And by adding a bit of clarity slider, it will add a bit of edge contrast to the entire scene and not only specific areas within the frame. So we're done with basic. We can come down to tone curve. Probably won't do too much here because there's general light areas on the bark, on the cat, and in the sky. Maybe just darks down a little bit just to bring a bit of that mood back. Throughout the histogram, you do have pure white, you have pure black, so not too much to be done there. But under HSL, not too much that I want to do in saturation, because saturation means how blue the blue is or how desaturated it is. What I would want to focus on here is how dark that sky is. So remember, the more you underexpose, the more color you bring back. So I'm going to pull that luminance to the left just to darken the sky ever so slightly. But because it's now made it too blue, come under saturation and decrease that as well to keep that grayish color in the sky. Come back to luminance. This orange patch or yellow, if I affect that, watch my lioness. She also changes up. So I would rather just go and do that in special tools, special adjustment tools a bit later on. But if anything, maybe brighten up the green slightly and maybe make it slightly greener, just to make it a bit more alive, if I may. Coming down to detail, this is where we can go and sharpen our image, and this is quite important, especially because there's a lot of noise in this image. What I will do after this raw edit is I will take it into Topaz denoise, in which I can eliminate a lot of the noise, well, a lot more of it in Topaz than I will here in Lightroom. If you have not yet seen my Topaz tutorial, go check that out on our YouTube channel. You can just type in Topaz on the Wild Eye YouTube channel and it will pop up, and very helpful, very simple to use, and I would definitely do that in this image. And seeing that I'm going to be doing that and also doing some noise reduction in here, I will be showing you the sharpening tool. So radius I always bring down to 0.5 because what sharpening does, it adds pixels to edge contrast. And by doing only 0.5, I eliminate or I lessen my risk of over sharpening, because by default it's at 1.0, which basically tells us it's adding an entire pixel to that edge. Whereas now by going to 0.5, I'm only adding half a pixel. Detail looks for the finer edge contrasts within the entire scene, so I'll take that to 100. And then again, I push and hold Option or Alt, left click on my cursor, and I drag this across the frame. So all that black that's now being introduced is not getting the sharpening tool applied to it. You don't want to sharpen an entire scene. You only want to sharpen the areas that need sharpening or need a little bit of enhancement in these areas. Because remember, your eyes go to sharpest areas, most saturated areas, and the brightest areas. So that's why this sharpening technique is very important, ensuring that only the white areas are being sharpened and not the entire scene. You want your viewer's eyes to go and sit, bam, on that and the tree on which she's standing. All right, and then your luminance noise reduction, I will do somewhat to push detail just to get some back. But as I'd mentioned, I'll do more of this in Topaz denoise. But just by doing that little bit, you can see quite a big difference in the quality of that background. So that's without the sharpening and the denoise. That is with. So quite a big difference there already. So that's basically it for my general edits, because everything I had done up until this point is a general edit. It's going to apply to the entire scene and add those adjustments to the entire scene. So what we want to do now is go a little deeper into the photograph and target specific areas to enhance it somewhat. So coming up to this round little figure over there, these are our special adjustment tools. If I go and select sky, let's see, it's done a pretty good job in selecting the sky in the background, but it also, if I push and hold spacebar, it brings or it eliminates or takes away the special adjustment tool cursor and brings back my normal zoom in and out and move around cursor. But as you can see, it's applied the sky filter to a lot of the cat and a lot of the tree. So if I just go simply left click on subtract, and I want to subtract, so you can choose a brush, whatever you want, but let me try and subtract subject. Let's see. Oh, great, does a good job. Takes a lot of the tree and a lot of the lioness. Because what we're going to do to the sky is, if I go all the way down and make it pitch black, you don't want your cat to be affected. Now, even though this is not by all means what I wanted to do, but that was just to reference and show you exactly what you want to target and what you don't want to target. So here we can drop highlights just a little bit more, maybe push the haze up somewhat. And if it does give you a bit of a funny color tone, you can just go drop saturation, and then you've got a slightly moodier, slightly more colorful sky in the background just by doing that. Easy as a click of a button. Now, there was one point of the sky. I'm going to use a radial gradient. And remember, by pushing and holding spacebar, you can zoom in. And that was this area. Remember, if I had affected the yellows or the orange in the color tones, it would have affected my cat. So I'm drawing it like this with quite a heavy feather, so you don't really notice it. And what the feather is this little red dot. So it's how hard of an edge this edit's going to be, or how feathered out. So from 100% in the middle of this circle, feathered out to the edges. Tapping O, getting rid of that, and just dropping my highlights. You can now see, if I go and put this filter on and off, look at that massive difference in the sky. Just a bit more detail, just a bit more color, and I'm very happy with that. Okay, and then lastly, what I'd probably want to do is, let's go select our subject. Okay, so it's selected a lot of this tree, which is important. You want that leading line up, but the main subject here is the tree. So what we can do is we can go subtract, use a brush, but then we need to pull the flow down quite heavily. And the reason I'm doing this is, remember, if I keep flow at 100 and density at 100, I flow over that area once, and it removes it 100%, which is not necessarily what you want, because this is going to eventually show off in your photograph, and people are going to realize what you've done, because light doesn't fall this direct. There'll always be some kind of shadow and uneven tones throughout. So let me go and push Command Z and undo that. If I subtract with a brush, but I bring my flow down and I flow over it once, you barely see it. But I start flowing over it a few times, you start seeing it coming off the tree. You notice that? Ever so slightly. So let's come to the greater scheme of things. My subtract brush. There we go. And let's just brush off this tree. Like, this bottom corner doesn't need to be as bright. So ever so slightly. But you don't want to take it off the cat. You want her to be the brightest part. So now basically when I go up to 100, look at how bright the cat is, 100 on exposure, and how the tree hasn't been affected too badly. It's because I've brushed off a lot of the tree. So even though it's slightly brighter, she's still the brightest part. Remember, as I've mentioned, your eyes get drawn to the brightest, sharpest, and most saturated pieces and areas within the frame. So by all means, this is not what I want to achieve, because that does not look great whatsoever. But just for the purpose of that exercise, you want to remove, with a soft flow, so a big feather if I may, on your brush, a lot of that subject selected. You can remove it entirely as well, but I'm going to do it this way. I'm going to tap O, and I'm going to increase my whites, increase my shadows. Remember, the foreground was shadow, and then maybe just a touch up on exposure ever so slightly. And then lastly, I'm happy with all of that. Lastly, what I will do is I'm going to use this linear gradient, and I'm going to pull from the bottom up. You'll notice there's a red dot at the bottom because I initiated my tool from there. Anything below that line is going to be affected 100%. fades to 75 to 50 to 25 to 0 above that line. I never like using the 100%, so I always bring it down quite far. You can hover over these sides to straighten it up, but something like that looks good. Tap O to get rid of that overlay, and I'm just going to reintroduce those shadows that I previously got rid of and draw it down. Now by putting that on and off, you can see how that foreground is quite bright. By implementing that tool, it just darkens that foreground ever so slightly. So what that's doing is it's pushing your eyes away from darker corners, pushing them up towards the brightest, sharpest, and one of the most saturated parts in the scene, being the lioness. That's where you want your viewer's eyes to sit. You don't want them mingling around down in the bottom in the grass and in the vegetation looking for something else. So darkening that up ever so slightly pushes your viewer's eyes away from these areas up to the brightest point, which is the lioness in the tree. Now I really love this result, and if I hit backslash, you will see that's the before, that's the after, that's the before, and that's the after. Now if I tap Y, you will see, why do I tap Y? To show you this. But you will see the before and after left to right. And quite a tremendous difference. If you look at all the detail that I managed to get back in the scene, even though she was so dark originally, if you look at that, compared to that, it's amazing what you can do with these tools and just the slightest adjustments to bring it back to life. But in saying that, it's also very important to understand how to photograph out in the field, exposing purposefully by underexposing for the sky, as we did here, knowing that when I bring it into Lightroom, this is exactly the type of edit that I'm going to do, is to lift that darker foreground and keep that background nice and moody. And like I said, I love this destination. It always offers incredible moments just like this. And I really just cannot wait to get back there. It's always a highlight of my year. And yeah, that is about it for this episode of Behind the Frames. If you have any of the images that you've seen myself or anyone else in the team photograph or share up on social media, and you want to see a quick edit on that, please let us know and we'll try and slot it in. And if you have any questions on this edit or this photograph or this destination, please get in touch. We'll always be happy to assist you. But that's about it for me. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode and I hope that you've learned something. But until next time, have a good one, stay safe, and chat soon. Bye-bye.